Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. My name is Philip Heitzen, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement and advisor to procurement leaders around the world. I started Art of Procurement to help leaders and their teams access the resources they need to increase their impact through insight-driven procurement. You are listening to our flagship podcast where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their impact with the needs of their business. And today is episode 400 of Art of Procurement. And to celebrate, I'm delighted to welcome back a longtime friend of the show, Kate Vitasek. Kate has been the driving force behind the University of Tennessee's pioneering research and development of the award-winning vested and vested outsourcing business model and movement. Kate's approaches and insights have been widely published in over 300 articles in respected academic and trade journals, as well as across 6 books. She's appeared on Fox Business News, CNN, NPR, and Bloomberg Radio for her commentary on strategic partnerships. And Kate recently co-authored a new book, Contracting in the New Economy, using relational contracts to boost trust and collaboration in strategic business relationships. And so, in today's discussion, I asked Kate, what are relational contracts? Why and when should we use them? And how should we go about putting them into place? I start by asking Kate how she came to focus on relational contracting.
So that is a fantastic question because, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a law school professor, and I'm a supply chain professor, right? So we study how to make things work. And so it really is just by layering back the onion that we saw a lot of the causes that you have in buyer-supplier relationships that don't work. You can actually track them back to both the procurement process and the contracting process. As I like to say, you get what you pay for. I'll take a really fun example that I love to pick on is the 60-day termination for convenience. So on one hand, we say strategic partnership, and then if we turn around and have a 60-day termination for convenience, it's like telling the supplier CFO, oh, that was just a joke on that strategic thing. I know we wanted innovation, but you really have a 60-day contract. So the CFO isn't going to make the investments that you desperately needed and wanted. And so there's so many inherent perverse incentives as we go through the procurement and the contracting phase. And both have their evils. I won't say evils. They're wonderful. It's great we have procurement. It's great we have lawyers. But we're not always aligned with what the business wants. And we have to have that alignment and bring in that relational component.
Yeah, I often think that, and you said it there with the 60-day term for convenience as an example, it's a strategic relationship when we want it to be, not when it is, kind of the win-win as we obviously talk about from a vested perspective. And so many supplier management programs are built like that as well, I feel, that we go out and we talk about there's the intentionality of collaboration and relationship, but none of the documents back it up. So when the business cycle changes, all of a sudden you're left in a really tough spot of how do I protect this relationship when the contract doesn't allow me to, or the contract is set in a way which I can just ignore all the things I said before, and you do that once and you lose trust forever.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the saying goes, well, why do I need the contract? Because if I have a great relationship, I just put the contract in the drawer. Well, that works wonderfully when you have a couple of people or a broader set that has a lot of trust and a good relationship. But that's not necessarily sustainable. Mm-hmm. I love, in our new book, Contracting in the New Economy, we actually talk about Chrysler. So there's Chrysler's a famous example of this. And at one point, Chrysler said, well, I'm going to be more like Toyota, and I'm going to build strong relationships, really work with my suppliers to develop improvement processes, innovation, help us, be good. And in the HU article, they actually said, and there was all these handshake deals. Oh, well, you're my supplier choice for this model, and so bring me all your great ideas and invest all this stuff and help me make a better car. You're my partner choice. Well, then Chrysler's purchased by Daimler. Well, sorry, that handshake deal goes out the window. And the trust then does as well. And so trust happens over time. And, if you're McDonald's and you have a history of 70 years of consistent behaviors of not only saying strategic partner, but you treat your suppliers in a very strategic way, they actually call it the system, then you have that trust not only in the individuals, but the organization. But most organizations don't have that. And if we know that relationships are important, why aren't we taking the time to write the relationship playbook, right? And to make it part of the contractual obligation. And this is where we come up with the idea of a formal relational contract, right? Because relational contracts, well, gosh, they've been studied, since the 1960s with Ian McNeil and Stuart McCulley. Stuart McCulley has one of the most cited articles in all of law, right? In all of the law scholars about relational contracts. And he posed this question, lawyers like contracts and business people don't. So we just stick it in the drawer and build a relationship. Well, if we know that relationship's so important, why aren't we embracing it and incorporating it into our contract? Thus, our HBR article, A New Approach to Contracts, is about a formal relational contract. Take that and put it into your contracts. Make your contract the playbook.
So what does a formal relational contract actually look like in practice?
So first, it's a flexible framework because, Phil, business happens, right? Business is dynamic. And so we need to embrace the fact that whatever we write today, business is going to drive us to probably change in the future. Now, if I'm buying pens, if it truly is a commodity and I'm just having a one-off transactional exchange, but anytime I get into these larger, more complex deals, outsourcing relationships in particular, a service component, I need to put that relationship front and center. So the contract opens up and it actually starts with a background on the fact that you realize you're entering into this strategic relationship. It is dynamic and you're going to have to change. So we set it up as a flexible contract. And the MSA, the Master Services Agreement, or whatever you want to call that, is where the legal terms are housed. And below that, you would have the schedules, which makes it more flexible. So I'm going to create this flexibility. So if the scope of work changes, I just go into a schedule and make an update. If there's an impact on the pricing, then I go into the pricing schedule and I make that update. And so you're treating your contract as a system where you've got these key parts of your system, and you want that flexibility for it to hang together. And you don't want people to be afraid of the contract, where it's, you have to go up, 10 layers in the organization to, quote, crack open the contract to make a change. We want to drive those changes so that the business people who are working realize that there's a change and they have to continually align the contract with the business practice so you're in alignment. So first, it is a flexible contract framework. So you got to keep that in mind. And so when you open it up, it actually starts with the background, but then the shared vision. So what is it you're trying to accomplish? Are you going to Mount Everest, or are you just going to a bunny hill? I use the analogy of a vested agreement is a outcome-based model. And we have boundary spanning business outcomes. So you're trying to climb Mount Everest, or you just need a bunny hill where you want the supplier outputs, which would be a performance-based kind of the guts of the contract. So you're going to put your shared vision, and then very, very important, you're going to put your guiding principles and intended behaviors. So guiding principles are social norms, things like honesty, equity, reciprocity, autonomy. And so the joint team will actually define and document what those guiding principles mean for that relationship. And those guiding principles will literally guide the governance team as business happens. So they come back and go, that's right, this happened. How do I do this? So it casts a positive shadow on the organization to make, what do I want to use the word? Holistic decisions instead of opportunistic decisions. Oh, put the contract in the drawer. I'm going to, as you said, I'm going to, you only pull it out when it benefits me. We're going to actually have a continual alignment of interests, this flexible framework where we're making joint decisions that are best in the best interests of both, and really try to avoid opportunism that erodes trust.
So sorry, go ahead, Kate.
Yeah, so then on the back end of that, then that contract, very important that we include governance. How do we use mechanisms that keep us in continual alignment? So I've got my framework here. I've got on the front, I've got where I'm going. In the middle, I have the guts, the work, the scope, the metrics, and the money. And on the back part of that flexible framework is the governance, or how we're going to manage the relationship and the business together.
So I have a bunch of questions that came out of that. And actually, one of them was around governance. So I'll actually start there before I go backwards with a couple of other areas. How do you govern? Like, how do you put a governance process around, you talked about principles and behaviors. How do you govern against whether somebody is acting up to their responsibilities that they've signed on to from a principle and behavior perspective?
So that's a great question. And so I want to point to behavioral economics. So a lot of our work, Phil, as you've highlighted in previous podcasts, anchors in behavioral economics. Mm-hmm. And so this concept of the guiding principles, well, how do you make that a contractual obligation to behave well? A very famous behavioral economics study, and I'm going to probably get the university right. It was Princeton or Yale, but they did this study and they asked students to sign a code of conduct. So students all signed this code of conduct, and they said, "Okay, great. So we're not going to cheat. Everybody agree? We're not going to cheat. Perfect." Well, then over time, it gets late. The students go out and party a little bit too hard, and they get tempted to cheat. It's no difference in business, right? Business happens, and we become opportunistic. We only want to behave with equity when it's good for us, or we only want to be honest to the point of, I don't want to tell you things that would help you if it hurts me, right? Why would I want to, that's going to hurt me if I tell you this. I'll just withhold that information. And so we get tempted. And so what they found in the study is that if they bring out that code of conduct and put it in front of the student right before they take the test again, and they said, "Oh, remember the code of conduct? We're not going to cheat. Will you just initial it here?" All of a sudden, it puts that halo that reminds you to not cheat. And that concept was made very famous by Richard Thaler. He won a Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for his work. A wonderful book called Nudge. And so it simply nudges people back in. So by having your contract be the playbook for your relationship, it's written in plain language, it's written with visualization. It's not something you put in the drawer, but you bring the relationship front and center, and you anchor it, you bookend it with the guiding principles on one side and the governance on another. You're basically teaching the organization how to stay in continual alignment. I've got my code of conduct and I've got my governance that says, "Oh, I'm going to nudge you back in."
Mm-hmm. That makes sense for sure. So when you think about a traditional contract versus a relational contract, what doesn't make it into a relational contract that you would typically expect to see in a regular contract?
So great question. And I think all the things that you would see in a contract, liability, indemnification, termination, they're all in there. But it's the words in which they're written. So first and foremost, not only do we have a flexible contract framework, but a relational contract is fair and balanced, and it's going to have more bilateral terms. So if you can terminate the contract in 60 days, I can terminate it in 60 days, right? So so now you have to step back and pause and go, well, what's the right termination? If I'm in a huge outsourcing agreement, a global outsourcing, deal, you can't get out of it in 60 days anyway. So quit pretending that's a clause that's even relevant, and instead say, well, what would be my justified business reasons for terminating, and how do I exit? So you might see then a much, much more words on things like an exit management plan without a termination for convenience.
Mhm.
Here's our justified business reasons for exiting, and here's how we're going to unwind.
Now, with that said, would a relational contract have the same kind of term lengths, or is it a little bit more open ended in terms of, we're not going to look at this in 3 years' time and decide whether we're going to go in another direction or not, but actually the only circumstances we would terminate is A, B, and C, because of a change of business conditions, as an example.
Mm-hmm. So the guts of the agreement, and one of those would be how long the contract is, depends on the sourcing business model. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'll point you, Phil, back to a podcast that we did on sourcing business models.
Yeah.
If you're in a vested agreement and it is designed for the supplier to drive innovations and transformation and business outcomes, you're probably going to have at least a 3-year, 5-year contract, if not more. But if I'm in a preferred provider relationship, it might be a year-long contract, but it's still going to put the relationship front and center.
Right.
Right. So the guts of the deal are appropriate for that business model, which is something that doesn't happen very often. Right. So when we study contracts, we see people tend to go to a standard, contract template and want to reuse a lot of the clauses. But a lot of those clauses aren't fit for purpose. They absolutely work perfect in an approved provider relationship, but in a performance-based contract, they don't work at all. And so people cherry picked the best, they think it's the best practice, but in reality, it's not the best fit.
Yeah, you're pushing on reasonable conditions. Insurance is a good example of where you see these engagements with such ridiculous insurance requirements that are built for something that doesn't reflect at all the services that's being provided. And when you think about contract length, you talked, and I've experienced it certainly in the procurement organizations I've worked in, is you almost have like this culture is, I sign 3-year contracts, or another organization might have a culture of I sign 2-year agreements, or I sign 4-year agreements. And what they're actually signing up for is irrelevant. They've just decided that that's the length of the contracts that we typically sign without really taking anything into account about what it is they're actually buying.
Yeah, so we teach a concept called architecting, right? And so you don't negotiate. As the deal gets more and more strategic and the relationship becomes more and more important, right? And the risk is higher and the dependency is higher. We would have organizations slow down and not just buy, sell, and negotiate, but to architect along 5 business dimensions and 10 contractual elements, exit being one of them. If I'm in an approved provider relationship, a 60-day or 30-day termination for convenience is absolutely appropriate. But if I'm in a very highly dependent outsourcing deal globally, Microsoft and Accenture, it'd be a fool's errand to think that you're going to be able to get out of that in 60 days.
Yeah. So you talked about it being flexible, and you mentioned at the beginning about the intention is to kind of unlock the contract, if you will, to make changes. You don't want it so it has to go to the highest level in the governance or to the wherever it is, and all the bureaucracy that entails. So what would a change management process look like for a relational contract? And does that look different than a typical contract?
Well, we would see decision rights, right? So part of governance, one of the rules or dimensions is around governance. And again, the governance is going to be different based on your sourcing business model. If I'm in a vested agreement, you're going to have a very heavy governance that is, more strategic relationship management. If I'm in a preferred provider relationship, I'm going to have a more conventional SRM, supplier relationship management. See the difference? Supplier relationship management or strategic relationship management. The governance is different. But all contracts should have a contract change management process. And we would teach to have decision rights. And so in your governance, let's take a typical vested agreement for facilities management per se. You've got a 3-tier governance structure. So kind of an operational, a strategic, and executive level. Yeah. So where are you pushing down to the operational level that they can actually make those changes? If the budget, if it's going to be a change that doesn't have a budget impact more than X, they're allowed to do that. So you want to push those decisions down to where the business where they can best be solved is at the right level. And all too often, people are afraid about the contract. They put it in a drawer they don't want to open up. They don't want to, quote, crack open the contract because they don't have decision rights and everything has to go up. And some things that's absolutely appropriate, but other things it misses the mark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that's interesting to me, as I think about this, and I'm thinking back to my days in outsourcing, is you would often have and you mentioned outsourcing as being, one of the areas that a relational contract can be used in is, business conditions change, the burning platform changes. There's lots of things over the length of a deal, and typically these are relatively long deals that change. And there's been so many contracts that I've been inside of that, even though everyone kind of knows that things are changing, nobody actually wants to open the contract because maybe it'll change from a provider perspective, the total cost or the total value, of the contract. And so they're trying to protect what they've already got. And those things always end in failure. It always ends with it being terminated, a year before the end of it, or running down the contract and everyone hates each other and no one wants to talk to each other ever again. So I can absolutely see a huge benefit of taking a relational approach and actually being able to change the contract as the needs of the business change, and actually being able to have an open conversation about that rather than, well, we don't want to give up this because you signed up to it, so tough, which is what I see in so many outsourcing contracts.
Right. And then, it's actually like burying your head in the sand. Mm-hmm. Business happens, and let's have the proper governance and the discussion to address the business needs and how we're going to deal with it. Yeah. And all too often, good deals, they just leave the contract and then they just deal with it, through the relationship. But over time, your contract and what you're doing, the difference, as Stuart Macaulay, a famous legal scholar, called it the difference between the real deal and the paper deal. Now you have a lot of risk because your contract actually isn't what you're doing. Wouldn't it be better to have a flexible contract framework that was always in alignment to what you needed and wanted and what the service provider was providing?
Yeah, and that relationship or that contract, I mean, the risk that you talked about is it's only as strong as the two individuals or however many individuals are involved that have that tacit agreement of how they're going to run things. And as soon as something changes, as soon as somebody gets a promotion or moves out or onto something else, then I mean, it's new people have different ideas, like you said back in that Chrysler example, and it all kind of goes to pot at that point.
Yeah, and actually, John Hinkey is an academic professor on the business side, and he's done some research on Chrysler, actually, and he estimates that Chrysler lost $24 billion, that's with a B, $24 billion in economic value because of the lost trust. So, right, so they put in informal relational contracts, right? So and that's great. So they had a ton of value from these informal relational contracts. And then they said, oh, no, sorry, I know you were doing that investment, you were doing this program, but you know what? We're going to go back to here when Daimler came in. And he tracked supplier trust and the lost profits that they projected that Chrysler had was $24 billion. Yeah. So we know that relationships are essential to these more complex deals. Why are we fighting it and writing a transactional contract when we know the relationship's important? And we often will then still write this transactional contract, have the relationship outside of the contract. And what we're saying is, no, slow down, put it in the contract. Write your contract as a playbook, not something that is supposed to be, stuck in a drawer and is rigid and everybody's afraid of.
Now, we talked about outsourcing a couple of times, but I wonder, is a relational contract, the domain of certain categories, or is it something that can really, it's more of a mindset and it can be applied to essentially anything that you buy, so long as it's something that is worth the investment of basically the time and the governance that goes along with it?
Yeah, it's really the latter, right? So the more dependent, the more risky, the more variable you've got changes, the more you should have a relational contract. And so if we align it back to the 7 sourcing business models, it's a preferred, performance-based, or a vested agreement should have a relational contract. And obviously, if you're doing a strategic joint venture or something like that, you absolutely should have a relational contract as well.
So, and I'm going to have to take a note because I lost my train of thought here. See, it's always me that has to edit for myself rather than anything else. Where was I going to go? So that's right. So as you think about putting a relational contract in place, now, is it something where you can look at an existing relationship and say, hey, I think that relationship, now I've thought more about the idea of relational contracts, would actually benefit from a relational contract, and let's try and renegotiate it or wait for the term to come up and put a relational contract in place the next time? Or is it more effective when you're really going from the outset relational first? Or does it matter, frankly?
You can do it in either case. And actually, in the book, Contracting in the New Economy, there's 5 steps that we promote. So same 5 steps as in the Harvard Business Review article. Yeah. The first thing you have to do is decide, well, what, do I want a relational contract? And we have a little tool, a little assessment tool that you can use to kind of map out and say, yes, I need a relational contract. And so it doesn't matter if it's an existing relationship you're, quote, flipping to a relational contract or a new one. And in one of the chapters, we actually have 3 case studies. So one was an existing good relationship, one was an existing bad relationship, and one was a brand new relationship. And you will see that it's possible in all of those scenarios. It really is a choice. It's a choice. And to us, if you have an environment that is, strategic, you want innovation, it's risky, it is changing, you're fighting it by not having a relational contract. You've got your head buried in the sand.
Mm-hmm. Now, would you recommend that an organization kind of puts a process in place to determine when to use a relational contract or not? Much like as you think about the sourcing business models where you're answering questions and there's criteria and that's kind of pushing you to one versus another. Would you do the same to say, hey, traditional contract versus relational, so that you get some consistency to how you actually leverage relational contracts, as opposed to it being somebody who's just in favor of it and decides, this might be a good thing for this deal?
Yeah, you should look at the factors. And actually, the sourcing business model map that we teach in the book, Strategic Sourcing in the New Economy, it's open source. It's available. We have a whole white paper on it as well. But it actually asks the questions about a relational contract. So in the business model mapping, you look at the economic model and the contracting model. So if you're using that business model mapping tool and you've bought into sourcing business model theory and you're putting it into practice, it will point you to the right model based on the answers that you provide.
Yeah, so that gives, so you were able to implement it from a consistent and again, kind of holistic perspective at an organizational level, as opposed to the whims of somebody who just believes that this is the right thing to do.
Yeah, and so ideally you take and do what we teach with relational contracts, and it's actually an extension to sourcing business models, right? Because, for example, a vested model is a formal relational contract with outcome-based economics, and so a performance-based contract should be a formal relational contract, and so you want to couple that in and bring the relational contracting component into your procurement process. We had an insurance company that actually they took the business model mapping toolkit and they made a little bolt-on tool to their ERP system. So anytime someone wanted to sign up with a supplier, right, they'd actually answer the questions from the sourcing business model map checklist, and they go, oh, well, this is a preferred provider, so therefore we need X, right? So it pointed them to the right sourcing business model and which type of contracting model they needed.
Do you find that the procurement leaders who are going down the route of relational contracting have to convince the suppliers that it's the right thing to do? Or is the supplier looking at this when you come to them and say, hey, I either I'm going to put in place a relational contract or I'd like to put in place a relational contract, that they're not pushing back and saying, I'm not really sure if that's something we want to do? Do they get pushback from suppliers?
I wish more suppliers would push back, but the old saying is the golden rule, those who have the gold rule. So the buyer really needs to lead this.
Yeah.
And it's not just procurement. It's not just operations. You have to start to bring in legal, because legal, often is driving these standard contract templates and the standard contract clauses. And it's wonderful from an efficiency standpoint, but in some deals, it's like putting a square peg in a round hole.
Right.
And that's drives perverse incentives.
Yeah. Now, the last question that I have, I wonder if there's a way that you've got a relational contract in place, and maybe there's a discussion happening of inside an organization, are relational contracts the way to go? Because you've still got change management, I'm sure, with legal folks as well, to adopt this approach versus a traditional approach. Is there ways that you can quantitatively actually measure the impact of a relational contract, so you can turn around and actually demonstrate, these are the benefits that we've achieved by going this direction and by doing this?
We've done some of that with the vested agreements, which, as I mentioned, should be a formal relational contract and outcome-based economics. So we try to capture the befores and afters in our case studies.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know of any empirical research that has been done that mathematically, statistically proves that, although there is tons of academic research talking about relational contracts, but most all of what they're talking about is informal relational contracts. The benefits of putting in the building the relationship, having trust in the relationship, putting governance in, right? So there's massive research that talks about the benefits of the relational components. All we've done, Phil, really is said, well, if we know, and it's been academically proven in all this research that relationships and trust build value, why are we ignoring that in our contract? And so we say we want a relationship, and it's like Chrysler, oh, we're going to build these wonderful relationships. And then all of a sudden, because our contract is something different, when it's convenient for us, we can just go back to what's in the contract. Well, that trust just went out the window. Yeah. And so these strong relationships are only as good as the people. And so you have good, sometimes very good relationship trust between the working people, but you don't have the corporate trust.
Mm-hmm.
I go back to where we started, termination for convenience. Yeah. I love you, Phil. I'm not going to invest in you with a 60-day termination for convenience. I'm sorry. I'm a CFO and I'm rational.
Yeah. This, I see kind of the biggest pushback is, and you just mentioned that it's kind of the trust between corporates, not between individuals. So, and as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, seeing so many times where you have this, we're going to put in place a relational program. You're very important to us. We want to encourage you to innovate with us. We're going to leave money on the table. All those good things that that procurement organizations who are looking to generate value that goes beyond savings do, knowing that they're investing in that relationship. And then business conditions change, and then it's all about cost savings, and the leadership it's kind of the hamster wheel. The leadership who are very relational get unfortunately let go, and then new leadership who is all about cost comes in and they just take all that off the table. And it's kind of the commitment to relational contracting is saying at a corporate level, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stick with you through good times and bad times. And that to me seems like it's the hardest thing to overcome. And that doing a relational contract signals that you're willing to do that as an organization.
Yeah, you're willing to put your pen where your mouth is.
Yeah.
And sign it, right? And it's no different than the little behavioral economics study that was done at one of the universities. You say you're not going to cheat. Oh, let me just nudge you back in. Yeah. And sometimes that's all we need is that nudge, right? So we put in our governance mechanisms and we put in the guiding principles, and we just need a gentle reminder that we're, cheating. We're being opportunistic because our natural behavior is to be opportunistic.
Well, I mean, I think that those the relational, well, I use the word relational too many times there. The relationship needs to be protected. And so the contract, it being a relational contract, protects that relationship. So it's even if a new regime, for example, or because the business conditions change and they want to go and take all that off the table that they left on the table, contractually they no longer can do so. And that makes it a moot conversation. They can't even go down that route. And so I think that's where it's really important.
And they can go down that route, but now they have to say, golly gee, I've changed my mind. Mm-hmm. Let's do a contract change order. And it's going to signal that we're going to go back to a transactional way of working.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's not that you can't undo it. You absolutely can. but you have to use your governance to make good business decisions that are fair and balanced and transparent and making those decisions, together. And so it really helps us avoid this difference between the real deal and the paper deal. The Chrysler dilemma of $24 billion, because of lost trust. They built up all this relational capital, and it was fantastic. And then, one fell swoop. Well, sorry, that was a handshake deal.
I know. It forces them to be explicit about the fact that they're going back on their word and their contract, as opposed to doing it, implicitly and trying to get away with it.
Yeah. So it's, and people might, I'm sure you have some lawyers that might be, if they haven't already hung up on your podcast going, what? Crazy business school professor at the University of Tennessee, right? Who the hell is she? But my co-author on the HBO article, David Friedlinger, amazing, one of the best minds in the world on relational contracts. He's a Swedish attorney. And Oliver Hart, a Nobel Prize-winning economist. Right. So we're looking at this problem. I'm bringing the business school perspective. David's bringing the practicing lawyer's perspective, and Oliver Hart's bringing the economic theory side of it. And so by collaborating and working together, we've really, relational contracts are not new. Right. What we've done is said, well, put your money where your mouth is, or your pen where your mouth is, and we know that they create value. Let's make our contract a playbook for how we uphold this relationship and invest in the relational trust versus put the contract in a drawer and be afraid of it.
Well, Kate, I want to thank you so much for your time today talking about relational contracting. And obviously, just kind of one last time to mention that you have written, along with your co-authors, Contracting in the New Economy, using relational contracts to boost trust and collaboration in strategic business relationships. I'd highly recommend anybody who's interested in this topic to go and check that out. And I'll include some links in the show notes. There's also some great case studies within the book that shows how organizations are putting this into practice. So the link to the book will be at artofprocurement.com/podcast. Just search for this episode and you'll find it right there. I'll also pop in there all the links to Vested. You talked about earlier the open source material for sourcing business models, and for Vested, you have a great resource at University of Tennessee. And I'll point everybody in that direction if they're not aware of it already. So Kate, one last time, thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for letting me share a little bit about our work and picking my brain on our latest book. We've had such fun writing it. I'm the only a lawyer on the thing. So if you don't believe me, read the book. It's written with 3 other lawyers. So it really does work, and I, as a business professor, that's what I study is how do you get things to work? And it really does work.
Yeah. And as listeners, longtime listeners to the show will know, and we've had these conversations on the pod as well before, Kate, I'm really a proponent of just building more collaborative, stronger relationships with our suppliers, and the power, the benefit, the impact that can have, and how sometimes that gets lost when things change, as we talked about today. So I think that this is a great practice to put into place. So highly recommend anybody checking the book out.
Awesome. Thank you.
I want to thank you for listening into today's episode of The Art of Procurement. To go deeper, including access to transcripts and actionable outtakes from the podcast, join the free level of our AOP Mastermind community. To learn more, go to artofprocurement.com/mastermind. And to find our entire back catalogue of almost 400 episodes, go to artofprocurement.com/podcast.